Now, I'm going to focus on the psychological aspects and explain potentially why the diet break studies have not been as robust as that first one. So my study, what we did, we took resistance trained females. They both dieted for 6 weeks, both groups. One group's strict 6 straight weeks of dieting, 25% caloric deficit for 6 straight weeks. And we also had them, both groups maintain, get 1.8 grams or aim for 1.8 grams of protein per kilogram of body weight, which is about probably like 0.8 grams per pound. They worked out in my lab. So every rep, every set, every workout was supervised. The other group also dieted for 6 weeks. So the diet lengths were identical, but the other group, the diet break group, they took a 1-week diet break after the 2nd week and after the 4th week. So their total study intervention was 8 weeks. At the end of the diet, there were no differences in any body composition or any physiological measure. So both groups lost a significant amount of body fat, which you would expect after 6 weeks of dieting, but no differences between the two. Both groups equally maintained their muscle mass, so they lost no muscle mass, and both groups maintained their resting metabolic rate. In fact, they actually went up just a little bit, but not significantly. So what's going on there? Well, let me also relate another study in resistance trained individuals. This one was in males and female athletes. This one was from an Australian group. They reported the same thing. Their resistance trained athletes at the end of their diet break study had no there was nothing superior about taking the diet break. So what is it with their study and ours? Now, there were some significant differences, which I'll get to in a moment, but I want to handle the physiological before I get to the psychological aspects. The reason that theoretically diet breaks work is because, as you said earlier, that a diet will cause problems, or what I like to say, there are negative consequences to dieting. I'm just going to rattle off some of them. When you're dieting, muscle protein synthesis is significantly lower. When you're dieting, muscle protein breakdown is significantly increased. When you're dieting, you induce a state of anabolic resistance. Growth hormone should increase into IGF-1 production. That is blunted. We refer to that as anabolic resistance. Other problems, all of those right there, muscle protein synthesis lowered, muscle protein breakdown higher, anabolic resistance. Those are all signs that you're probably going to lose muscle mass. And we see that in dieters. Now, not your dieters, not my subjects, because we prevent that. But generally, you'll lose muscle mass. You also, when you lose weight, in particular, if you lose muscle mass, you also have a reduction in your resting metabolic rate. If your resting energy expenditure or your resting metabolism goes down when dieting, that makes fat loss much more difficult as the diet goes on. And unfortunately, it makes fat regain much more likely when the diet is over. So you have all of these negative consequences of dieting. Theoretically, the utility and value of a diet break is to interfere with all of these negative outcomes. But in our study and in the Australian study, the only studies that have been done in resistance trained individuals, the likely reason they were not effective, the diets didn't induce anything negative. So there was no suppression of metabolic rate. There was no loss of muscle mass. The diets were not elongated. The caloric deficits weren't severe. So I'm going to use a carpenter word here. We were fixing something or trying to fix something with a diet break when something wasn't broke. So if there is no damage or negative consequences, the utility of a diet break becomes worthless. Now, I'll follow it up with one sentence, then any feedback you have, and then I'll just end with the psychological data, which is pretty cool.
Okay.
Bodybuilders, physique athletes, bikini competitors, guess what they do? Well, they do diet for long periods of time. They are pretty severe many times in their caloric deficits if they're stepping on stage. So in those people, which none of our studies looked at, again, we were more resistance trained females. They weren't that lean. The Australian study were athletes. They weren't getting that lean. In bodybuilders, they are going to experience these negative outcomes. So in that population, I would not be surprised if diet breaks are much more effective. So you got to be careful. I wouldn't want people to look at my study, oh, there's no benefit. Well, I'm going to show you, I'm going to talk about some benefits, but we got to appreciate there was nothing negative about the diet. So if I could do the study again, I would have dieted them longer, and I would have tried to been a little bit more, I would have wanted to induce negative consequences. And that sounds rude, but that's what scientists do. We also kill rats. So
yeah,
that's
no,
what
I was actually going to say the same thing, Dr. Campbell. You know, it would be different if, let's say, if there was a 40% deficit applied and the study was 16 weeks, you know, something like that.
yes.
But, you know, then again, I can understand where you're coming from. Like if there's only a 25%, you know, reduction in calories being made, right? You're not forcing an extreme level of, you know, stress on the system. And like, what are you trying to fix with the diet break? Because you're really not forcing too much stress on the system. You know what I mean? So it makes a lot of sense to me. But I would love to hear more of your experience in this study that had to do more with the psychological perspective.
Yeah. And somebody might say, well, why didn't you just go ahead and do that? Do a 40% for 16 weeks. And I'll tell you why, because nobody would stick to that. Bodybuilders would, but bodybuilders won't sign up for our studies because they don't want to be told how much protein and what kind of training to do. Yep. So
it would be extremely hard to fill that study.
Yes.
Yeah.
That is why, and you said this, and I'm going to actually wear this with pride. My lab is the one that does the most close research to what bodybuilders can actually latch on to. Mm-hmm. Dieting, you cannot give a general population person the same type of diet that a bodybuilder would do, which it's no surprise. You only see case studies in bodybuilders because there's one, and many times they're doing what they want to do. So there's a reason. All right. So in my study, again, only the second study ever done in resistance trained people with the utilization of a diet break. We gave our subjects something called the 3-factor eating inventory questionnaire. That has 3 compartments: hunger. So it measures hunger. And this is validated. This is probably the most validated eating inventory in existence. Restraint and disinhibition. So hunger is what it sounds like. If hunger levels are high, there's a greater likelihood of relapse or stopping a diet. Restraint, that is your ability to say no to food. You need restraint to be high when dieting. If restraint is low, there's a greater likelihood of relapse or not adhering to a diet. Disinhibition is a term that I don't like because it always makes me think, well, it's this, and then you have to dis that. So it's a double negative. But disinhibition is the tendency to overeat. And in particular, it's the tendency to overeat when there's highly palatable foods in front of you or during stressful situations. So you want disinhibition scores to be low. You don't want them to be high because you don't want a high tendency to overeat. So out of those 3 measures, our subjects, we saw a significant difference in only one of them, and that was disinhibition. The groups that did not take a diet break, their disinhibition scores over time slightly increased over the 6-week diet. The diet break group had the opposing trend. Their tendency to overeat or their disinhibition scores went down over time. And again, that's a good thing. That was a significant difference. So you might say, well, that's just one finding out of 3, but here's where I'm going to say this, and this is where it gets interesting. The other study from Australia in resistance trained people, they also did some hunger related psychological assessments, and they found that hunger was significantly less in the group doing diet breaks, and the desire to eat was significantly less. So that's both studies, both in resistance trained people, that have reported the same thing. Taking periodic diet breaks helps with hunger. And now I'm just going to make one more statement, and then I think I'm talking too much. Why do people fail diets? Because they lose the battle to hunger. They give in, their desires too high. They have a tendency to overeat. The diet breaks seem to help prevent that. So I'm seeing, if both of our studies had been extended over 4, 6, 8 months with diet breaks, potentially then we start to see a physiological or body composition value, but they were too short to get to that point. One last thought. Why would diet breaks help with this? Well, I think because you're allowed to eat the foods that you would normally not eat. You're kind of, you're handling the cravings. You're not constantly having to have high levels of restraint during these diet breaks. So that's what I think. So what we can say right now is in lean people, don't expect a huge advantage for fat loss according to the research, but the dieting process should be easier. Well, it is easier according to ours and that other data.